Hey World Civilizations, Mr. Lassiter with you, and in this video we're going to continue with our theme of decolonization, and we'll be looking at decolonization in Africa. This video really won't be able to do this topic justice, and I think you'll see why as we see the amount of countries that become independent, but we will try our best to look at some representative cases. So here are our video goals. We want to look at the shapes that decolonization took in Africa, compare the struggles for independence in several representative countries, and try to identify some of the economic and political problems the new independent African nations faced. This map you can see the over 45 countries that gained independence in Africa following World War II. There were a few nations that had gotten independence before or had never been taken over. But overall, most of the nations in Africa gained their independence from European powers post World War II. To look at this struggle for independence, just need to remind you that by 1900, remember that nearly all of Africa was colonized by European nations, and after World War II, a lot of people in Africa began to push for independence, and they did so in a variety of ways: war, diplomacy, and protest. Over 40 countries become independent just between the years of 1945 and 1975 alone. And this is a process that is still taking place. Many countries in Africa still undergo governmental changes. For example, the country of South Sudan only became independent just a few years ago. So this is still kind of an ongoing process that we can see within the continent of Africa. I think right now it's up to something like 55 countries on this continent. We will look in our case studies today at several examples: Ghana and Kenya, Algeria and South Africa, and at their independence movements, some of which do not stop just with being declared not a colony. But again, as we'll see that many of them face struggles. So let's look at the transition to independence for two pretty representative countries, Ghana and Kenya. In 1957, Ghana became the first former British colony to gain its independence, and it was led by the guy you see pictured to the right on the front of Time magazine, Kwame Nkrumah. He was a very young nationalist, and he actually had a Western education, and he was the driving force for independence in the Gold Coast, or what became known as Ghana. Many African leaders, like Nkrumah, are nationalists, and they have national goals for the people in these colonial holdings, and they basically want to throw off Western imperialism, and they do so again in a variety of reasons. In Kenya, it was a little bit of a different struggle. Jomo Kenyatta led a tense struggle for independence. When fighting against this independence, the British declared a state of emergency in the colony. They banned all political protest on part of Africans. They even imprisoned Kenyatta and several other protesters for 8 years in response to their protests. Eventually, Kenyatta was released from prison, and he successfully negotiated with the British for Kenyan independence. And Nkrumah and Kenya also become the leaders of their countries. Nkrumah was the first leader of Ghana. Kenyatta elected the first president of Kenya. And these leaders also advocated something called Pan-Africanism. They sought the unity of all Africans around the world, and they pushed for a greater cooperation in gaining independence and ending colonialism and imperialism in Africa. And so that's one of their long-lasting legacies. However, not everywhere was it so, I'm not going to say easy. Not everywhere was this done relatively peacefully. For example, in Algeria, it was a colony of France. And the post-war French government was determined to maintain control of this colony. Even the president of post-war France, Charles de Gaulle, says, "One cannot conceive of both an independent territory and a France which continues to aid it." Basically, he was threatening these colonies, that if they declared their independence, that they would lose all aid from the country of France. So this can be seen as kind of an economic threat to them if they achieve independence. And Algeria was extremely important because it had a French settler population. They had vineyards there, oil and gas fields, which, as you know, are very valuable. And so there's this tension between native Algerians and the French settlers. And in 1954, a revolt breaks out in Algeria. And the resulting war was extremely brutal on both sides. Eventually, it does end in with French withdrawal and Algerian independence, but that's not going to be until 1962, after 8 years of war. The wars that we see in sub-Saharan Africa for independence never really matched the same scale as the Algerian War for Independence, and some other French colonies gain independence without having to fight these wars, and some even before Algeria gains independence from 1958 to 1960. And part of that is because of Algeria's importance to France at the time. But they had to struggle against it and ultimately give their lives to their independence movements. In some places, we see early independence, for example, South Africa. However, independence did not necessarily mean equality for all peoples in some of these countries, especially in southern African nations. So South Africa is granted independence in 1910. Later on, it kind of says, we don't want to listen to the Queen anymore. They become a republic. But the government was entirely controlled by the minority, which were the minority white settlers in South Africa. And so they are going to respond very negatively when this group called the African National Congress, very similar to the Indian National Congress, forms in 1912 and starts to agitate for rights for the majority blacks in the country. By the 1950s, South Africa's white government had instituted a system of strict laws of racial segregation, and these became known as apartheid, which enforced prejudice and oppression of the majority, which were the black Africans in South Africa. So there was a major struggle against this apartheid. Demonstrations oftentimes were met with violence. Sometimes demonstrations turned violent. And Nelson Mandela, who was the leader of the ANC, was actually arrested, and he was imprisoned for over 25 years and became a worldwide symbol of the struggle for equality in South Africa. And it was not until many of the nations around the world stopped supporting the South African government and instituted economic sanctions and started kind of publicly shaming them on the worldwide scale that apartheid is finally dismantled. And so the struggle, apartheid lasts actually until the 1990s, and it's dismantled. Mandela is released from prison, and in 1994, South Africa held their first free elections, where black Africans could vote, even though they were the majority. And Nelson Mandela was actually elected president, and you can see there on the right, he is being sworn in as the first black president of South Africa. So we've seen some of these different shapes that African independence movements took, but there were post-colonial struggles, and most of these were economic or political. For example, European countries had arbitrarily drawn borders, and these arbitrary borders, as we've been talking about, put different ethnic groups or linguistic groups within a country, groups that had a history of animosity towards each other, and in some cases, this animosity was spurred on by European powers who would put one group in charge of the other, or would give favoritism to one group or another. And so this resulted to many ethnic conflicts and civil wars, which raged sometimes in the short term, and other times have gone on decades, and some which are still raging in post-colonial Africa. Also, post-colonial Africa, because they were colonized, were mainly exporters of raw materials. They did not have the infrastructure and industry built up in their countries as one would expect. And so they relied sometimes on just a single crop or export. For example, Liberia was a major exporter of rubber, and that was what they relied on. Nigeria relies almost entirely on oil. And so if your country only relies on one thing, that makes for a weak economy. Also, there are other problems that are faced: overpopulation, corruptions within government. Uh, there are several severe droughts throughout Africa in the second half of the 20th century, which led to widespread hunger and starvation. There have been health concerns such as malaria and HIV and AIDS. You know a great deal about malaria in Africa from your Malaria Day that you did for Flex Day. And then also government instability. This leads to overthrows, military regimes, and just violence that continues to plague some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Um, but overall, these are the commonalities in the post-colonial struggles that are faced in this region. Here are your video goals. Once again, make sure that you can answer these questions. If not, go back and watch the video again. Thank you. Bye-bye.